In the fall of 2009, I decided to stop eating meat. I will recreate this process that led me to determining that I no longer wanted to eat meat as an example of critical literacy as comprehension, and how the reader, was able to respond to the prompts that allowed me to become a vegetarian. My initial exploration into deciding whether I wanted to continue to eat meat or cut meat out of my diet, I pulled from two schools of thought and the resources that supported them. One was a pro-vegetarian lifestyle, which I found a lot of articles and a lot of books explaining the health benefits of no longer eating meat, as well as the moral component, which told me that eating another animal is immoral. The other side, I found many articles telling me that I should eat meat, oftentimes supported by claims made by different think tanks, and also the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So I had to look into these sources and decide what was their thinking behind them. And oftentimes, the vegetarian proponents said that cutting meat out of your life would have a positive effect without supporting any specific company or specific group of companies. It oftentimes said you could get protein from different sorts of beans, but never labeled specific providers of beans. And the moral component was supported by a plea towards living a more humane life, whereas the things that supported eating meat were often supported by groups paid for and created by national dairy farmers and national beef farmers, which led me to believe that those findings were questionable, because there's a strong financial component to those to that information. That if I were to stop eating meat, these people would be readily financially affected, whereas much of the vegetarian literature that I read supporting a vegetarian lifestyle was had no immediate or tangible connection to someone else's financial gain. After my initial run of looking at both positive and negative documentation of living a vegetarian lifestyle or a carnivore lifestyle, I decided to look at several texts and think about them in terms of problem posing. In terms of generally the majority of carnivore supporting texts, I found that, as I mentioned previously, there was an immediate financial component to it, but there's also a social component that played onto this, and I noticed a lot of terms equated people who didn't eat meat with being weak or not manly, things like this. So I began to pose this problem and reread these texts with a lens to social bias, and I found a lot of times there was a strong social bias against people who didn't eat meat, mixed in with sort of the science that they used to explain why you should eat meat. In terms of the vegetarian literature that I read, I found a similar social component it seemed like things were, as I mentioned before, were divided into two separate camps. The positive health benefits and the moral component. The health benefit articles seemed to stand on their own. They were very rarely mixed, and when they were, the social component was clearly addressed as such, that that the author was trying to provoke you to make a moral decision, and they wanted you to be aware that you were being asked to make a moral decision. And there was also articles that were purely based on morals and the social component of being a vegetarian. So the same problems that I posed to the carnivore supporting articles weren't necessarily there in the vegetarian articles, because the vegetarian articles were very upfront about what they were trying to do. And also, as I mentioned prior, they did not have a fiscal component that was immediately apparent in their argument. Eventually decided to round out my decision by engaging in alternative means of informing myself between the pros and cons of eating meat and not eating meat. I looked towards different music. There's very strong support of not eating animal products in a lot of very confrontational and abrasive music, which I am prone to listening to. And I also sought it out with my friends.
I don't know how you can't eat meat. Meat's delicious.
So I'm not going to try to talk you into being a vegetarian, but it would make my life easier as far as only having to prepare one meal rather than two. I believe that it is a healthier diet, and I want you to be healthy. And I also don't want to have to worry that one day you're going to eat our cats.
Yes, I do think that in my using my critical literacy, I focused on issues of power and promoted reflection, transformation, and action. I thought a lot about who was in power and the power behind what messages I was receiving. I reflected deeply on not only why I was being told things, but what I was being told, and if those ideals matched my own ideals. I was able to take transformation into account in both myself and the world around me, and then I eventually took action based on the process that I undertook. Absolutely think that I focused on the problem at hand and the complexity about that problem. It was very easy for me to get behind the moral component of no longer eating meat. Many friends of mine who are devout meat eaters will readily admit that it is gross that they're eating somebody else. But the health issue was very difficult for me to get behind initially. It's very complex when a lot of outlets that you're told to trust, particularly the FDA, and you're also taught to believe things that is very official sounding, and a lot of the meat lobbying people have different think tanks that are specifically constructed to sound important and to sound reliable. So I had to look beyond not only the health benefits or the health risks of being a vegetarian, but I also had to really reflect on the complexities of who it is that I trust in society, and where multinational corporations stand in my in relationship to who I can rely on and who I can trust. I definitely think that I was open to and used techniques in terms of vetting my information and adapting the contexts that I noticed around different modes of information to truly understand where they stood in my understanding of the truth and my understanding of values. So I definitely feel that I was critical, using critical literacy in. Definitely feel, above all, aspects of my critical literacy and my application of critical literacy in this process that I examined multiple perspectives. As I mentioned, I looked at several different readings. I engaged with pop culture and found and discerned what information I could find and what representations of art that I was already interested in had similar values. And then I also sought out my friends and my family and asked them how they felt. So I really tried to cover every sort of resource that I was able to engage with this topic and with a critical eye and close attention to being aware of my own critical literacy.